It was on a night when the city lights trembled like stars fallen to earth that his life collided with hers, not in gentle greeting, but in the raw spark of something neither of them could name. Alexander had always walked with the air of a man untouched, the kind of figure who seemed carved from marble, every movement controlled, every glance measured. Yet beneath his perfectly pressed suit and the armor of silence he wore in public, there was an ache he could not cure, a grief that refused to loosen its grip. He thought himself untouchable, but destiny often arrives quietly, dressed as an accident, disguised as something ordinary, until it breaks you open. That evening, as rain traced silver rivers across the windows of a crowded cafe, a woman with tired eyes and a light hidden deep within her chest stepped into his path, and in that moment the world shifted, as if time itself leaned forward to listen. Her name was Maya, though he didn't know it yet. To him she was simply a presence, soft but steady, carrying warmth the way others carried shadows. She moved as if she had already known pain, but chose not to let it harden her. Instead, there was healing in her gaze, the kind of quiet comfort that reminded you of childhood lullabies you had forgotten but still carried in your bones. When she looked up, when her eyes met his across the dim glow of the cafe, the noise around them blurred into silence. He felt, for the first time in years, the possibility that his carefully guarded world might not be as unshakable as he believed. People would later say their first meeting was nothing remarkable, no storm swept in, no glass shattered dramatically. Yet, for those who have lived with loneliness pressing against their chest like a weight, the smallest gesture can feel like a miracle. The brush of her sleeve against his arm, the accidental fall of her book at his feet, the way his hand reached, almost reluctantly, to return it. Such a simple exchange, yet within it lingered a question neither dared to voice. What if this stranger is the one thread that pulls apart the whole tapestry of my solitude? He told himself it was nothing. He told himself he didn't care. But the memory of her stayed, like the aftertaste of sweetness you cannot forget, like the echo of music after the song has ended. When he closed his eyes that night, he saw the curve of her smile, hesitant and kind, a smile that did not beg for attention, but gave it freely. It unsettled him. It unsettled him because it was real, and real was dangerous. Yet the universe has a way of circling back, of orchestrating meetings when hearts are not ready, but desperately in need. The next morning, fate folded its pages neatly and placed her once more before him, not in a cafe, not in the fleeting chaos of strangers, but within the very walls of his guarded life. She stood there in his home, introduced as the new caretaker of his children, the twins who bore his late wife's eyes and his own silence. For an instant, his chest tightened, not from anger, but from something he didn't want to name. There she was, the woman whose presence had lingered in his thoughts, now woven into the rhythm of his days. From the very beginning, it was not smooth. He wanted control, rules, order. She brought warmth, softness, laughter that spilled into corners he had long since allowed to gather dust. He wanted silence at the dinner table. She asked the children to tell stories, to speak of dreams and fears. He wanted grief buried, locked away in a place no one could touch. She allowed the boys to remember, to speak of their mother, as if love did not vanish with breath. Every instinct in him told him to resist, to push her away, to protect the fortress of pain he had so carefully built. And yet every night he heard the boy's laughter filter through the halls. Every morning he caught the quiet way she tended to them, healing not only their wounds but his own, even if he refused to admit it. He began to watch her without meaning to. The way her hair slipped loose from its tie when she bent over to tie a shoelace, the way she hummed while folding laundry, filling the air with a peace he had never thought possible. The way she carried her own sadness not as a burden, but as a lantern, lighting the way for others. He told himself again and again that it was nothing, but the truth pressed harder each day. She was not simply passing through. She was altering the very shape of his home, of his heart. There was resistance, of course. The human heart rarely opens without a fight. He argued with her over rules, over boundaries, over the fragile line between memory and hope. Yet every time his voice rose, hers remained calm, firm, but never cruel, reminding him that love is not weakness, that healing is not surrender. And the children, oh, the children, saw what he could not. They clung to her hand, leaned into her embrace, whispered to her when the night felt too heavy. They recognized in her the home they had lost, and they trusted her with the innocence he had nearly crushed under his grief. Days melted into weeks, and he found himself waiting for her presence, like one waits for dawn. He noticed the way her laughter softened the boy's fears. He noticed the way his own shoulders loosened when she entered a room. And slowly, against his will, the marble shell around his heart began to crack. It terrified him. It thrilled him. It made him believe for the first time in years that perhaps the story of his life was not finished. There are beginnings we expect, and beginnings we never ask for but need most. This was the latter. A meeting that seemed trivial on the surface, but was destined to become the cornerstone of everything that followed. What started as an accidental encounter in the rain had become the spark of a transformation neither of them could escape. And as the nights grew warmer, as the children's laughter grew steadier, as silence gave way to music once more, Alexander knew he was standing on the edge of something vast, something terrifying, something beautiful. Because love, when it arrives uninvited, does not knock gently. It breaks down the doors of loneliness, floods the halls of sorrow, and plants itself in the cracks of your soul until even the darkest corners begin to bloom. And in her presence, every part of him, broken, bruised, guarded, began to believe that maybe healing was not only possible, but inevitable. And so their story began, not with fireworks or grand confessions, but with a quiet moment that grew roots. It was here, in this fragile intersection of grief and grace, that something new began to take shape, and as the days carried them forward toward trials they could not yet see and tenderness they could not yet admit, the truth settled silently between them. Love had already entered the room, and nothing would ever be the same again. If you are still here, listening to this story unfold, let it breathe into you a little warmth. Let it remind you that healing does not come all at once, but in small, steady moments of connection. And if this beginning touched your heart, if it gave you even a spark of comfort in your own quiet night, you can leave a little note in the comments or press the like button as a way of saying you felt it too. And if you wish to stay close, to follow the journey as it deepens, subscribe and walk with us into the chapters ahead, where the heart learns not only to endure, but to love again. Because this is only the beginning, and what waits just beyond is both fragile and luminous, a tale not of perfection, but of two lives daring to believe that broken things can still become beautiful. And so, as their story breathes into its next moment, we step forward, hand in hand with them, toward whatever tomorrow dares to bring. Childhood has a way of leaving shadows that follow long after the days themselves are gone, and Alexander's shadows stretched wide across his life. He had not been born into gentleness. The Reed estate looked like a palace of glass and iron from the outside, but within its walls had lived a boy who learned early that silence was safer than laughter. His father, stern and unbending, believed affection was weakness. His mother, delicate and often absent in spirit, drifted through rooms like a ghost of a woman who once dreamed of love but had long since surrendered. Alexander grew tall beneath ceilings that never echoed with bedtime stories or soft lullabies. He learned figures and strategies before he learned tenderness. He studied business reports before he studied how to hold someone close. By the time he was 15, he already knew how to wear a mask so perfectly that even he believed it. And yet, somewhere buried beneath the weight of discipline and expectation, there lingered the faintest memory of comfort. A housekeeper, long since gone, once sang to him when fevers shook his body as a child. The melody was foreign but soothing, the kind of song you don't understand but feel. It was a fragment of healing he carried into adulthood without even realizing it. A reminder that love could exist even in small and fleeting gestures. Perhaps that was why Maya's presence unsettled him so deeply. She reminded him of that forgotten warmth, the possibility that kindness did not demand permission. For Maya, childhood was another world entirely, and yet not without its own cracks. She was raised in a modest home where faith was stitched into the fabric of daily life. Her mother hummed gospel tunes while folding laundry. Her father's hands bore calluses from years of honest work. They did not have much, but what they had was wrapped in togetherness. Still, there were losses. Her younger brother, Isaiah, had been taken too soon, cancer stealing his laughter before the world had truly heard it. Maya was 15 when she stood beside his hospital bed, whispering promises she could never keep, that she would carry him into every sunrise, that she would keep his joy alive. And though grief nearly broke her, it also carved into her the belief that love must be given freely while it can, that healing is not about forgetting, but about remembering with gentleness. These beginnings shaped the people they became. The man who built walls so high, even his children struggled to climb them, and the woman who carried lanterns into darkened places so no one else would have to sit in shadow alone. Their meeting had not been coincidence, it had been collision. Two pasts so different, yet both bruised, finding themselves intertwined in the present. Alexander's wife, Emily, had once been the bridge between him and his softer self. She laughed in colors where he only saw black and white. She carried music into the quiet halls, read stories by candlelight, turned rainstorms into adventures. When illness came, it carved her body thin, but never dimmed her spirit. She whispered to their sons that joy could still live in broken places, and for a time Alexander believed her. But when she was gone, the silence returned with a vengeance. He told himself that protecting the boys meant making them strong, teaching them control, burying their grief. He forgot that healing does not come from denial, but from presence. Maya walked into that silence carrying her own scars, but also carrying a resilience born of loss. The boys saw her first not as an intruder, but as someone who could listen. She knelt on the rug and tied their shoelaces with care. She asked them about their drawings. She let them cry without shame. In her presence, their memories of Emily became less frightening. Instead of whispers, they were not allowed to speak. They became stories they could share freely. Alexander watched all of this with discomfort, because it unraveled the order he clung to. Yet deep inside, something stirred, a recognition of what he had long denied. There is a peculiar beauty in seeing your own children reflect back to you the lessons you've forgotten. The twins reminded him daily that softness was not weakness. They laughed with abandon when Maya sang silly songs. They fell asleep easier when she spoke of angels and love. They clung to her as if she had always been part of their world. It pierced Alexander like a blade, the realization that what they needed most was the very thing he had forbidden: tenderness. The old wounds of his childhood and the sharp grief of his present collided in him, and for the first time he admitted he did not know how to mend them. He began to notice how Maya carried her own memories like treasures instead of chains. When she spoke of her brother, there was sorrow, yes, but also light. She remembered him with laughter, not only tears. She carried him forward by living fully, not by burying his name. This quiet courage became a mirror for Alexander. If she could hold her grief and still move with warmth, then perhaps he could learn to hold his too. He started small, awkward steps that felt clumsy in the light of her ease. He read bedtime stories, though his voice stumbled over the characters. He attempted breakfast, though the pancakes burned and the eggs stuck to the pan. He sat with the boys while cartoons played, even when he didn't understand their jokes. And though each effort was imperfect, it was noticed. Ben smiled again. Theo crawled into his lap again. Healing did not arrive with thunder. It arrived in whispers, in burnt food and small laughter, in the slow unraveling of fear. And always, always, Maya was there. Her presence softened the sharp edges of the household, not by force, but by constancy. She did not demand, she simply stayed. She reminded them, wordlessly, that family is not built on perfection, but on persistence. The story of their childhoods lingered in every gesture, every silence, every tender moment that began to blossom between them. They were not just two adults meeting by chance. They were the sum of every wound, every song, every loss, and every fragile joy that had carried them to this point. The contrast of their pasts did not separate them. It braided them together. He had been forged in discipline, she in devotion. He had been hardened by silence, she softened by song. Together they began to create something new, a rhythm of living that allowed both shadows and light to exist in the same space. And so the days unfolded, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that something was shifting. He, the man of marble, began to thaw. She, the woman of warmth, began to trust. The children, once caught between grief and fear, began to laugh freely again. Healing was no longer a distant dream. It was here, in the messy, imperfect, everyday moments of life. The past had shaped them, yes, but the past was no longer a prison. It had become soil, rich with the possibility of growth. And as Alexander and Maya stood on the threshold of what might come next, they carried within them not only the weight of what had been lost, but the promise of what could still be found. The chapter of their beginnings was written in shadows, but the story ahead was already shimmering with light. And as the evenings softened into gentler nights, as the boys clung a little less to sorrow and a little more to hope, a truth emerged quietly between them. Love was not an escape from their pasts, but the very path through them. It was the healing they had been waiting for, and it had already begun. And with that, life carried them forward into the next unfolding, where the fragile bond of trust would be tested, and where love, like a seed watered by grief, would rise toward the light, refusing to be hidden any longer. The rise of what bound them together did not appear like fire racing across the sky, but like dawn, gentle and unrelenting, light seeping into corners that had forgotten warmth. Alexander had been a man who believed devotion was measured only in provision. Food on the table, bills paid, futures secured with the sharp edge of his ambition. Yet devotion, he soon learned, had another language, one spoken in small gestures he had once dismissed as trivial. It lived in the way Maya's voice softened when she read the boys their bedtime tales, in the way her laughter turned the cold marble halls of the house into a sanctuary, in the way her presence alone seemed to remind everyone within reach that healing was not an abstract idea, but a daily rhythm. The first true glimpse of change came one Saturday morning. The boys had begged for pancakes again, and against every instinct of self-preservation, Alexander stepped into the kitchen armed with a mixing bowl and a determination that bordered on reckless. Maya stood nearby, tying her hair back, watching him as though the sight of a man in a crisp shirt fumbling with flour was both endearing and tragic. He ruined the first batch, burned the second, nearly surrendered by the third, but when Ben giggled and Theo shouted that the pancakes looked like funny faces, something inside Alexander broke open. He laughed, genuinely, not the rehearsed smile he wore for boardrooms, but a laugh that startled even him. And when he looked up, Maya was watching, her eyes lit not with amusement alone, but with something gentler. Approval, even tenderness. That moment lingered long after the pancakes were gone. It was in these seemingly ordinary spaces that love began to thread itself between them. He started to notice how Maya filled silence, not with words, but with presence. When the boys argued, she knelt to their level, listening with patience until anger dissolved. When evenings grew heavy with memories of Emily, she did not erase them. She held them like fragile glass, reminding the children that remembering was not betrayal. Alexander found himself pausing in doorways more often, lingering just to watch her move through the house with that quiet grace. Each time he told himself he was only observing. Yet in truth he was learning how to listen, how to soften, how to let love breathe where once he had only commanded. The rise was not without resistance. Old habits clung tightly, whispering that control was safer, that vulnerability was dangerous. One evening, when Maya suggested that the boys could keep a small journal of thoughts for their mother, Alexander's instinct was to object. He wanted to shield them, to stop grief from taking root again. But when he saw their eager faces, the hope that writing might help them, he swallowed his protest. That night, as he passed their room, he heard Theo whispering into the pages, "I miss you, Mommy. But I laughed today." His chest tightened. Healing was not erasure. It was remembrance, softened by love. Publicly, he was still the Alexander Reed the world knew, sharp, calculated, unyielding. But privately, he found himself loosening ties earlier. putting away his phone more often, kneeling on the rug beside dinosaurs and crayons instead of spreadsheets. He found himself carrying the boys on his shoulders through the garden, something he had never done before, the sound of their laughter echoing against the stone walls. Each act, small though it was, became a step in his ascent, not toward power, but toward fatherhood, toward humanity, toward love. And through it all, Maya was both witness and companion. She never demanded, never rushed. She let him find his own way, though her presence was the compass he didn't realize he followed. When he stumbled, she steadied him not with correction, but with quiet trust. When he succeeded, she let her smile tell him he was more than he believed himself to be. The children saw it too. They began to draw pictures not only of their mother in the clouds, but of their father holding hands with them, of Maya standing beside them all beneath a sky scattered with stars. It was as if the boys had already seen what Alexander and Maya were still too cautious to name, that family was no longer a memory, but a living, breathing thing being rebuilt before their very eyes. As weeks turned into months, the household found its rhythm. Evenings of quiet sorrow turned into evenings of stories and laughter. Family dinners, once solitary affairs for Alexander, became sacred rituals. He would sit across from Maya, the boys chattering between them, and he would feel something stir deep within, gratitude, unfamiliar and overwhelming. He began to realize that the climb he was making was not toward the old self he thought he had to recover, but toward a new life entirely. He was learning to be present, not perfect. And yet, beneath the surface of all that light, there was still the weight of unspoken things. Alexander carried the memory of Emily with reverence, unsure how to balance it with what he was beginning to feel for Maya. Maya, for her part, carried her own quiet fear, that she was being woven into a story she had no right to finish, that one day she would be asked to step back into shadow. These hesitations hummed in the background, threads of uncertainty woven through their rising bond. But even hesitation cannot stop what is meant to grow. The rise was inevitable, written not in grand gestures, but in the constancy of daily life. Love grew in spilled cocoa wiped from the table, in stories told under blankets, in the sound of children sleeping peacefully because they finally felt safe. Love grew in the way Alexander's hand lingered near Maya's when they passed plates at dinner, in the way she caught his gaze and held it for a fraction longer than necessary. It grew in silence, in laughter, in grief shared and softened. And with every small step, Alexander felt the marble fortress of his heart crumble further. He no longer feared the cracks, for he was beginning to see that it was through those very cracks that light entered. Healing had not come in the way he once imagined, clinical, rational, efficient. It had come gently, through her, through the children, through the simple act of showing up. And the more he leaned into it, the more he realized he was not just rising back to who he had been before loss, but rising into someone entirely new. The rise to this fragile, luminous connection carried them onward, toward a horizon neither had dared to imagine. And as the seasons shifted outside, the garden blooming with wildflowers, the evenings stretching long with golden light, they both knew that something had taken root between them, something too strong to ignore. The story was no longer about survival. It was becoming a story of love itself, tentative but undeniable, waiting to be tested, waiting to be declared. And so with the rise came the promise of the shadow ahead, the inevitable turn where love would be challenged, where healing would be questioned, where the fragility of their bond would face the weight of the world. Yet for now, in the warmth of their newfound closeness, they allowed themselves the gift of believing in this moment, that love, even born from brokenness, could rise, and in rising, teach them how to live again. Every love that dares to grow must walk eventually through shadow, and theirs arrived not with thunder, but with quiet tremors that deepened until they could no longer be ignored. For months the Reed estate had pulsed with new life, the boys laughing again, Alexander softening, Maya bringing light into corners that had once only known grief. But healing, as gentle as it may be, always stirs old wounds, and the world rarely leaves fragile beginnings untested. It began with a letter, a plain envelope, no return address, slipped among bills and contracts, yet heavier than them all. Inside, written in a hand Alexander recognized but wished he didn't, was the name of a sister-in-law he had not seen since Emily's funeral. Claudia. Her words were poised, her tone sweetened with politeness, but beneath it ran a vein of steel. She wanted to reconnect, she wanted to see the boys, and she hinted at Emily's final wishes, whispered in private conversations long before she died. The moment he read it, Alexander felt the weight of threat. What she wanted was not simply connection, she wanted a claim. He hid the letter at first, tucked it into a drawer as though paper could be silenced by wood. But silence has a way of seeping, and soon the boys overheard fragments of phone calls, hushed arguments, the tension that filled their father's voice. They asked questions Maya could not answer. "Will someone take us away?" Theo whispered one night, his voice trembling. Maya gathered him into her arms, pressing her cheek against his hair, promising safety, though her own chest tightened with uncertainty. Healing is fragile when fear enters the room, and in those days, fear walked beside them all. Alexander confronted Claudia weeks later when she arrived uninvited at the estate. The air that morning was sharp, the sky low with heavy clouds. She stood in the doorway dressed impeccably, carrying the authority of bloodline and entitlement. Her eyes swept the house as though she already measured where she might fit. Maya met her first, steady but cautious, introducing herself with grace. Claudia's response was a smirk, a cool, "Of course," the nanny. Words meant to reduce, to dismiss, to remind everyone of their place. Alexander arrived moments later, his face a mask carved from years of control, though his fists tightened at his sides. The confrontation was polite only on the surface. Claudia spoke of family legacy, of Emily's supposed intentions, of the boy's need for proper influence. Alexander countered with truth, his devotion, his presence, his fatherhood, but her words dripped with implication, that Maya's presence was an intrusion, that the children's healing was a fantasy, that courts could be swayed by whispers of blood. By the time she left, the air in the estate was heavy, like a storm held at bay by fragile glass. The following weeks unfolded with tension threading through every quiet moment. The boys clung more tightly to Maya, sensing the uncertainty that even whispered conversations could not conceal. At night, Alexander sat awake in his study, legal papers spread across the desk, bourbon untouched at his side. For years he had fought battles with numbers, contracts, hostile takeovers. But this was different. This was not a boardroom. This was his family. And beneath his fury ran fear. The fear that a stranger's claim, bolstered by law, could undo all the fragile healing they had built. Maya, too, carried her own conflict. She wanted to stand firm, to believe love was stronger than documents. But late at night, she would fold laundry with trembling hands, wondering if she was building a home she might be forced to leave. Her bond with the boys had deepened into something that felt eternal, yet the very depth of that love made her ache. Healing had tethered her to them, but what if the world decided it was temporary? The day of the hearing arrived beneath a grey sky. The courthouse, sterile and cold, seemed the last place to measure love. Claudia arrived with her lawyer, her pearls gleaming, her voice smooth with practiced sorrow. She painted herself as the rightful guardian, speaking of promises Emily had supposedly whispered, of bonds of blood that could not be ignored. Her words wrapped themselves in sentiment, but beneath lay ambition. When it was Alexander's turn, he stood tall, yet his voice was not the commanding tone of a businessman. It was gentler, deeper, touched with the humility of a man who had finally learned what mattered. "I won't pretend I have done everything right," he admitted. "I grieved poorly. I built walls. But I never stopped showing up for my sons. They are thriving not because I am perfect, but because love lives in our home now." His eyes flicked to Maya then, lingering, acknowledging silently what words could not. When Maya was called to speak, she rose slowly, every eye upon her. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice did not falter. "I have seen these boys carry grief no child should ever carry," she said softly, "and I have seen them grow into laughter again. They remember their mother with love, not with fear. They cry when they need to, and they know they are safe. That is not because of blood, but because of presence. Love is not who shares your name, it is who carries you when you cannot walk on your own." The judge listened, silent, her gaze steady. Hours passed, statements repeated, documents shuffled. And then, at last, the ruling. Claudia's petition denied. The boys would remain where they belonged, with their father and with the woman who had become more than a caretaker. In that moment, Alexander exhaled for the first time in weeks, his chest loosening, his shoulders softening. Maya closed her eyes briefly, whispering a prayer of thanks. Healing had endured the storm. That night, the house glowed with quiet relief. The boys slept early, exhaustion pulling them into dreams safe at last. Alexander poured wine for Maya on the porch, snowflakes drifting like confetti in the cold air. "I don't know how to thank you," he said simply. She shook her head, her smile small but certain. "You don't have to. We're in this together." The words lingered between them, warm as the fire inside. Yet, even in victory, scars remained. Claudia's attempt had rattled them, reminding Alexander how fragile love feels when tested by the world's weight. He realized then that what they were building was not invincible, not immune to storms, but perhaps that was what made it sacred. Because to choose love again and again, in the face of fear, in the face of loss, was to live with courage. Maya felt it too, that truth humming in her bones. She had not come to the Reed estate to replace anyone. She had come simply to give, to offer healing where there was silence. But now she understood she had become part of something larger. A family forged not by perfection, but by the decision to hold one another through both joy and sorrow. As December drew close, the estate transformed once more. Garlands wound along staircases, the smell of cinnamon lingered in the air, and the boys' laughter returned brighter than before. Alexander, for the first time in years, decorated the tree himself, hanging an ornament Emily had once chosen, then stepping back to let Ben and Theo add their own creations. Maya stood nearby, humming softly, her voice weaving healing through the room. The storm had passed, and though clouds still hovered at the edges of memory, their home pulsed with a peace that felt earned. Yet love is not only about surviving battles, it is about what comes after, the tender moments that follow when hearts are raw and open. For Alexander and Maya, the shadow of the conflict had not dimmed their bond, it had deepened it. It had shown them what they were willing to fight for, and it had given them a glimpse of what they might one day fully claim. Not just a fragile arrangement, but a love unafraid to stand in the light. And so, as the snow fell and the season turned, they stepped gently but firmly into the next chapter, not without scars, but with the quiet conviction that healing was no longer something they were chasing. It was already here, alive in their laughter, their struggles, their victories. It was alive in the fragile, luminous love that had survived its first storm, and that would carry them into whatever awaited beyond the horizon. Grief has a way of leaving echoes that never truly fade, and for Alexander, the echoes of Emily's absence still lingered like a soft ache beneath his ribs. Even as the house filled again with warmth, even as Maya's laughter wove itself into the rhythm of their days, there were nights when silence pressed down on him like a tide. Those were the evenings when he found himself standing at the window of his study long after the rest of the household had gone to sleep, staring into the garden as if the dark branches might answer the questions he was too proud to voice. It was in one of those hours, the night air brittle with frost, that Ben padded quietly into the room, clutching a folded sheet of paper. His small voice broke the stillness. "Daddy, can we write letters to Mommy?" The request cut through him. For so long, Alexander had believed grief was something to be contained, hidden, managed like a financial account, controlled so it wouldn't overflow. But when he looked into his son's eyes, he saw not weakness, but courage. And so he nodded, his throat too tight for words. That night, they sat together on the floor with crayons and paper, Theo joining soon after. The boys wrote in careful, uneven letters, whispering their thoughts aloud as they scribbled. "I hope you can see us," Theo said softly. "I hope you know we're happy again." Alexander's own hand trembled as he picked up a pen. For a long time he could not write. But then he remembered Maya's words. Healing does not mean forgetting. And slowly, in small, uneven script, he wrote, "I'm learning how to let them laugh again. I'm learning how to let myself laugh too." The next morning, he found Maya in the kitchen, the letters still folded in his pocket. She was humming quietly, the sound low and steady, as though she herself was gathering courage for the day ahead. When he showed her the papers, her eyes softened. "This is good," she whispered. "This is how healing takes root." She didn't suggest sending them anywhere or locking them away. Instead, she took a small wooden box from a cupboard and placed the letters inside. "A memory chest," she said. "Somewhere grief can live without stealing the present." It became a ritual after that, Quiet evenings of writing, not every day but often enough to let the boys know that their mother was still part of their story. And yet, for Alexander, the act stirred something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. One evening, after the boys had gone to bed, he opened the chest alone. Inside were not only letters but small drawings, stick figures of a family beneath a bright sun, a woman with hair like a crown, always smiling. There, nestled between the children's innocent scrawls, was his own folded page. When he read the words he had written, his chest constricted. The marble shell he had worn for so many years was cracking, not in ruin, but in release. It frightened him and relieved him all at once. Maya noticed the change. She saw it in the way his shoulders no longer carried the same rigid weight, in the way his voice softened when he called the boys to dinner, in the way he lingered in the kitchen just to pour her an extra cup of tea. One evening, after the boys had drifted off, they found themselves sitting on the back porch, silence stretched between them, the stars scattered like salt across a velvet sky. It was Maya who broke the quiet. "You're allowing yourself to feel now," she said gently. He turned his head toward her, searching her face. "And if I don't know what to do with it?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "You don't have to do anything. You just have to let it be real." It was not long after that night that Alexander suggested they visit Emily's grave. He had avoided it for months, burying himself in work, in fatherhood, in distraction. But now, with the letters, with Maya's steadying hand, he felt it was time. The morning was cold and overcast, the air filled with the smell of damp earth. He dressed the boys in warm coats, each carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers picked from the edge of the garden. Maya walked beside them, her presence quiet but grounding. When they reached the headstone, white marble etched with the words "Beloved Wife and Mother," silence fell heavy. The boys knelt first, placing their flowers carefully at the base. "Hi, Mommy," Ben whispered. "We miss you." Theo added, "We talk to you every night now." Alexander stood frozen, the words caught in his throat. For years he had believed strength meant holding everything in, but as he looked at his sons, two small bodies bent in love and remembrance, something inside him broke open. His voice cracked as he finally spoke. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come." The admission hung in the air like incense, painful but cleansing. He brushed a fallen leaf from the stone, his hands trembling. "I thought being strong meant pretending I didn't feel, but I was wrong. Strength is letting yourself feel and still standing back up." The boys leaned into him then, small arms wrapping around his waist, and for the first time since Emily's passing, Alexander allowed himself to cry openly. Maya stood at a respectful distance, her own eyes glistening, her heart aching with the sight of their release. When they left the cemetery, something felt different, not lighter, but steadier. The visit had not erased grief, but it had given it a place to rest. That night, after the boys were asleep, Alexander sat beside Maya on the porch again. The silence between them was no longer heavy but companionable. He turned to her, his voice low. "You've given them something I never could, and you've given me something I didn't know I needed." She shook her head softly. "You gave it to yourself. I was just there to remind you how." Their eyes held, and in that gaze was a truth neither had yet spoken aloud. Love was growing, slow but certain, rooted in loss, yet reaching for light. In the weeks that followed, their household blossomed in quiet ways. The boys began drawing more, laughter spilling into corners once hushed. Alexander discovered he enjoyed reading bedtime stories, even when he stumbled over words. Maya introduced small traditions, family dinners on Fridays, gratitude notes pinned to the fridge. It was during one of those evenings, with string lights glowing in the living room and s'mores melting on their fingers, that Theo asked, "Do you think Mommy can see us having fun?" Maya hugged him gently, answering with warmth, "If she can, she's smiling." Alexander swallowed hard, then said softly, "She'd want nothing more than for you to be happy." And for once, his words were not forced. They were true. The turning point came when Alexander found Emily's old journal tucked away in a drawer. Inside were prayers, poems, and notes written in her graceful hand. One entry read, "I pray Alexander learns that strength isn't silence, but love." He showed it to Maya, his voice breaking. She saw what I couldn't. Maya placed her hand over his, whispering, "And now you do." The moment carried both sorrow and peace, healing in equal measure. Slowly, Alexander began to step into the role he had once feared. He was no longer just a provider, but a father present in every sense. He laughed with the boys, listened when they spoke, even learned to play their games with clumsy eagerness. Maya watched quietly, her heart swelling as she saw him transform, not into someone new, but into the man he had always been beneath the armor. The climax of that season came one evening when the boys, with crayons and construction paper, presented Maya with a card. 4 stick figures stood, hand in hand, beneath a sky of stars, 2 small, 1 tall with straight lines for hair, 1 with curls that resembled her own. "That's us," Ben said proudly. "You're part of our family now." Maya's throat tightened, tears springing to her eyes as she whispered, "Thank you." Alexander watched from the doorway, his chest heavy with something he no longer resisted. In that moment, the truth was undeniable. Love had already claimed its place among them. What began in grief was transforming into belonging. What once was silence now pulsed with warmth. The healing that had once felt fragile was becoming the foundation of something unshakable. And though none of them dared to name it yet, each knew in their hearts that love was no longer a guest in the Reed estate. It was home. The season moved forward, carrying them with it, and as winter settled deeper around the house, their bond stood steady, a fire against the cold. The past still lived within their walls, but it no longer ruled them. Love had taken root in the soil of sorrow, and from it bloomed something tender, resilient, and true. And as the days stretched toward spring, the story of Alexander and Maya unfolded not as a replacement for what had been lost, but as a continuation. An echo transformed into a song of its own, warm enough to heal, strong enough to endure, and beautiful enough to believe in. Snow had already melted into the soft earth of early spring, yet within the Reed estate something far deeper was thawing, a man's guarded heart and a woman's long-hidden fear. Alexander and Maya had crossed the storm of grief, endured the sharp trial of Claudia's intrusion, and now stood in a gentler season, though not without questions that lingered quietly between them. Healing is rarely linear. It spirals, returns, circles back to test the resolve of those who carry it. In those days, what tested them most was not outside conflict, but the quiet weight of intimacy unspoken. Alexander began to notice how silence between them was no longer heavy, but charged. At the breakfast table, When Maya leaned over to pour juice for the boys, her hand would brush his sleeve lightly, and though accidental, it left a warmth that lingered long after. At night, when she read to the twins, he often sat in the doorway just to hear her voice, the cadence steady, the healing tone wrapping around his sons like a blanket. But he also realized it wrapped around him, softening places in his chest he had not believed could soften again. Maya, for her part, carried a dual awareness, gratitude for being welcomed into the rhythms of this home, and fear that she had allowed her heart to grow too close. She reminded herself often that she was not meant to replace anyone, that Emily's presence still lived within those walls. Yet when the boys clung to her at night, whispering, "Don't leave," she felt the weight of belonging settle into her bones. Belonging heals, but it also frightens, because once you belong, loss becomes unbearable. It was during one quiet evening that the unspoken began to demand space. The boys had fallen asleep after a day of running in the garden, the air fragrant with budding blossoms. Maya lingered in the kitchen, stacking dishes with absent hands, humming a tune she barely realized was rising from her lips. Alexander stepped into the room, his tie loosened, his presence softer than usual. For a long moment he simply stood there, watching her as though memorizing the shape of her movements. Finally, he spoke. "You always hum when you're at peace." She looked up, surprised. "Not always," she answered. "Sometimes I hum to find peace." That single exchange shifted something. Their eyes held longer than they intended, and though no more words were spoken, both carried the echo of it into the night. The following week, the family discovered Emily's old prayer journal in a drawer untouched since her passing. The boys stumbled upon it first, their excitement immediate. They begged to read it, and Alexander, though hesitant, allowed it. Together they sat on the living room floor, pages spread open. Emily's words filled the space. Notes about the children's first sentences, her fears during the illness, her hopes for Alexander to discover that love was not weakness, but the truest strength. Tears blurred his vision as he read. Maya placed a hand gently on his, steadying him with the silent reassurance of presence. For the boys, it became a treasure. For Alexander, it was both a wound and a balm. And for Maya, it was a reminder that she had stepped into a story already written, yet somehow had been written into it herself. In the nights that followed, the journal became a ritual. Each evening, one passage would be read aloud, sometimes by Alexander, sometimes by Maya. The boys added their own notes beside their mother's handwriting, filling the margins with love drawn in crayons and crooked letters. It was not erasure, it was continuation. Healing took form in ink and paper, in the mingling of past and present, in the acceptance that love multiplies rather than replaces. But with closeness came the stirring of deeper emotions Alexander could no longer ignore. One evening, after the boys had gone to bed, he lingered with Maya by the fireplace. The journal lay closed on the table, the fire casting gentle light across her face. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "She wrote about you," he confessed. "Emily. She called you a woman with quiet fire. Said you'd change this house without even raising your voice." Maya's breath caught. "She barely knew me." "She felt you," he replied. His eyes burned with truth. "The same way I do." Silence stretched, not awkward, but trembling with unspoken acknowledgement. Finally, he whispered, "I think I'm falling in love with you." Maya's heart jolted, though she had sensed it, though she had feared it. She did not rush to answer. Instead, she placed her hand over his, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you for saying it, and thank you for not asking me to rush." Her response was not a rejection, but an invitation to let love breathe, to grow without force. From that night onward, their connection deepened, not in declarations or grand gestures, but in the quiet ways hearts speak when words are scarce. He brought her coffee in the mornings, remembering exactly how she liked it: no sugar, extra cinnamon. She began to linger at the dinner table a little longer, even after the boys dashed off to play, her laughter more open, her eyes softer when they met his. They began to share pieces of themselves they had never told another: his fear of failing as a father, her guilt for not being able to save her brother. These confessions, raw and fragile, became threads weaving them closer. Still, shadows lingered. One evening, while folding laundry, Maya admitted softly, "They're getting attached quickly, I'm afraid." Alexander frowned. "Of what?" She hesitated. "Of hurting them, if I ever have to leave. Of hurting myself." He moved closer, lowering his voice. "You're not their mother, Maya, and you don't need to be. But you are something to them, something they need, something I need." His words carried more than reassurance. They carried plea. That Friday night, family night, had become tradition. They transformed the living room with blankets and string lights, laughter echoing as the boys piled onto pillows. Halfway through the second movie, Theo curled into Maya's lap, Ben against Alexander's side. It was an image of family, imperfect but whole. When the children finally drifted into sleep, Alexander whispered across the soft glow, "Would it scare you if I said you already feel like part of our family?" Maya looked at him, her eyes glistening. "A little," she admitted, "because once you call someone family, they expect you to stay." He leaned forward, his voice quiet but unwavering. "Then I'm asking you to consider staying." Though she gave no answer that night, she did not pull away. And that silence, steady and calm, was enough. The season turned, and with it came new beginnings. Maya began planning a small learning center in the carriage house, a dream she had carried for years. Alexander encouraged it, even offering to help fund it. "You've given this family more than I can repay," he told her. "Let me give something back to you." Her smile that day was one he never forgot, soft, luminous, filled with hope. Love was no longer just possibility. It was becoming practice. It lived in the way they navigated grief together, in the way they built rituals of belonging, in the way their hands lingered a little too long when passing dishes. The house, once haunted by silence, now pulsed with warmth, laughter, and the steady hum of healing. And yet, as every story knows, love that grows must face its own tests. For while they had built something beautiful within those walls, the world beyond still carried challenges waiting to intrude. Their bond, tender but resilient, would soon be asked to prove itself in ways neither had yet imagined. But for now, beneath the glow of string lights, with two children sleeping peacefully between them and the fire casting shadows that danced like promises across the walls, Alexander and Maya allowed themselves to believe in the fragile, luminous truth of what was unfolding, that love had already taken root, and that perhaps, just perhaps, it was strong enough to last. Spring ripened into summer with a tenderness that seemed almost deliberate, as though the season itself wished to bless the fragile rhythm that had begun to take hold inside the Reed estate. The garden bloomed wild with colour, the trees heavy with life, and the laughter of children spilled freely across the lawn like water from an unsealed jar. Yet even in this abundance, Alexander and Maya moved carefully, like two people aware that their steps carried not only their own weight, but the trust of two small boys who had finally begun to believe that home was safe again. Healing, as Maya often reminded herself, was not a single act, but a practice, day after day, presence after presence, love given without condition. It was during one of those golden evenings that the boys asked for family stories. They curled up on the rug with sketchbooks in hand, crayons scattered around them, their faces bright with anticipation. "Tell us about Mommy again," Theo urged, his voice soft but eager. Alexander hesitated, his throat tightening, but Maya nudged him gently. "Start small," she whispered. So he did. He told them about the day at the beach, when Emily buried Theo in sand up to his neck and pretended crabs would nibble his ears. He told them about how she danced barefoot in the kitchen when no one was looking, about how she collected seashells and whispered secrets into them. The boys giggled, wide-eyed, their hands busy sketching waves and shells on paper. And as Alexander spoke, something inside him loosened, a knot that had lived there for too long. Maya watched, her heart swelling as she saw him lean into memory, not with fear, but with gentleness. Later that night, after the boys had fallen asleep with their drawings tucked beneath their pillows, she found him in the kitchen, staring at one of the seashells Emily had once kept on the windowsill. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. They deserved to know her joy, not just her absence. Maya touched his arm softly. "And you deserve that too." In that moment, the quiet between them was not empty. It was filled with trust, with the steady hum of healing taking root. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of life settled deeper. Friday family nights became sacred traditions. One week they roasted marshmallows in the fireplace. The next they transformed the living room into a fortress of blankets and flashlights. Laughter became the household's native language. It was during one of these evenings, while the boys dozed half asleep under the glow of string lights, that Alexander leaned close to Maya and whispered words that startled even him. "You make this house feel alive again." She turned, her eyes shimmering, but before she could answer, Theo stirred and mumbled, "Best family night ever." They both laughed quietly, letting the children's innocence shield them from saying more. Yet the truth hung in the air, undeniable. The summer brought new beginnings outside the estate as well. The carriage house renovation was nearly complete, transformed into what Maya would soon open as her learning centre. Alexander visited often, sometimes with coffee in hand, sometimes with the boys in tow. He marveled at how she moved through the space, clipboard in hand, directing with quiet authority. He admired her vision, her devotion, the way she carried her brother's memory into the work without letting grief define it. One afternoon, as sunlight spilled through the wide windows, he leaned against the doorway, watching her arrange bookshelves. "You've built more than a school," he said softly. She glanced up, smiling. "It's a garden," she replied, "a place for children to grow, for families to breathe." Her words struck him deeper than she knew, for wasn't that what she had done for his own family? She had tended to them like soil, watered them with patience, and waited as love grew. As the centre's opening day approached, the boys' excitement grew wild. They painted wind chimes with bright colors, eager to hang them on the trees outside. On the morning of the dedication, neighbors gathered. Caroline brought fresh flowers, and laughter filled the air. Maya stood beneath the cherry blossom tree, her voice steady as she spoke. "I built this place for little hands and big dreams, for children who need safe spaces, and for families still learning how to be whole. We plant seeds here, not just of knowledge, but of love." She bowed her head and whispered a prayer, simple but strong, and when she opened the doors, the building filled with life. Alexander stood a few steps away, pride swelling in his chest, a pride that was not about business or wealth, but about her, about the woman who had walked into his life quietly and rebuilt it with gentleness. Later, as twilight settled, he found her alone beneath the same tree. In his hand was a small silver locket shaped like a heart. He pressed it into her palm. "For everything you are," he said, his voice low. Inside was a picture of the four of them at the kitchen table, laughing. Her eyes welled, but she did not speak. She only closed the locket, held it against her chest, and let silence speak for her. The season unfolded with this delicate balance, the weight of the past beside the light of the present. The boys thrived, Theo squeaking out notes on his violin at dawn, Ben sketching portraits of their family with surprising tenderness. Alexander thrived too, though he would not admit it aloud. His laughter was freer now, his touch gentler, his gaze less guarded. And through it all, Maya remained the steady heart at the center, carrying her own scars with dignity, but offering love that did not falter. One evening, after a long day of lessons at the garden room, she sat on the porch with Alexander, exhaustion softening her shoulders. The boys were chasing fireflies on the lawn, their laughter rising like music against the night. Alexander handed her a glass of water, his fingers brushing hers. For a moment they simply watched the children play. Then he turned to her, his eyes unflinching. "I've been thinking about what forever might look like." The words hung heavy, tender, undeniable. Maya inhaled sharply, her heart pounding, but his next words were softer still. "Not a promise I expect you to give, not a decision tonight. Just the idea of it. You, me, them, this life. It feels like something worth holding on to." Her eyes glistened, and she leaned into his shoulder, whispering, "Forever sounds quiet and strong, like a prayer." He closed his eyes, pressing his forehead gently against hers. "Then let's keep praying." The fireflies blinked around them, the night air warm, the sound of children's laughter carrying across the garden. And in that moment, they both knew that love had grown beyond survival. It was no longer fragile, no longer tentative. It was a living thing, rooted deep, steady enough to weather storms, luminous enough to guide them forward. Healing had brought them here. Love would carry them further. And as the stars rose above, silent witnesses to their promise, the story continued, moving steadily toward the horizon of what was still to come. Autumn arrived with a tenderness that seemed painted by unseen hands, every tree around the Reed estate clothed in shades of amber and crimson, the air filled with the earthy scent of leaves surrendering to the ground. Life had shifted into a rhythm that felt steady, sacred even. The mornings began with the boys bounding down the staircase, hair rumpled, eyes bright, their laughter carrying into the kitchen where Maya moved with effortless grace. Alexander had grown accustomed to the sound of her humming, the way it slipped into the cracks of the house like sunlight through shutters. It had been months since the court battles, months since the raw ache of uncertainty, and though grief still lingered like a shadow in quiet corners, healing now pulsed like a heartbeat through every room. Each day carried with it small proofs of transformation. Ben had taken to sketching with a devotion that surprised even his teachers, his notebooks filling with portraits of family scenes, his father cooking, Maya reading by lamplight, the four of them holding hands under stars. Theo, with his boundless curiosity, insisted on practicing violin at dawn, filling the estate with squeaks and sudden bursts of melody, yet no one complained. Instead, Maya clapped at each attempt, and Alexander, once so rigid, now laughed even when notes collapsed into noise. Healing, they discovered, was not found in perfection, but in the joy of trying together. Alexander himself had changed in ways both visible and unseen. His colleagues whispered about the softer tone in his voice, the way he cancelled late meetings to be home for dinner, the way he seemed less like a man driven by numbers and more like a man tethered to something real. But at home, his transformation was most evident in the simplest acts, kneeling to help Theo with shoelaces, learning to braid Ben's hair on a dare, pausing in the garden just to watch Maya hang fresh wind chimes. He had once believed strength was forged in control. Now he realized strength was revealed in gentleness. Maya too carried a new glow, though she herself hardly noticed it. The garden room, her small learning centre, had blossomed into a haven for children, its walls filled with drawings, its air ringing with laughter. Parents lingered longer at drop-off, confiding in her, thanking her, calling her presence a gift. Yet, for all her outward devotion, it was the quiet moments at night that revealed the depth of her belonging. When she tucked the boys in, when she found Alexander waiting by the porch with tea, when their conversations stretched into midnight, weaving threads of past sorrow into present hope. It was during one of those evenings, the first frost settling outside, that Alexander finally let words spill that had been living in him for months. The boys had gone to bed, their whispers fading into dreams. Maya sat curled in a chair near the fire, a blanket draped over her shoulders, her curls loose, her eyes heavy with weariness, but still alight. He stood watching her for a long while before stepping closer, his voice quiet but steady. "You came into this house when it was broken," he said. "You could have walked away, but you stayed. And because you stayed, this place became a home again. You gave me back my sons, you gave me back myself, and somewhere in all of that, you gave me you." His throat tightened, but he pressed on. "I don't know if love is supposed to look like this, born from grief, built in pieces, but I know it's real, and I know I don't want to live another day without it." Maya's eyes brimmed, her hand clutching the blanket tighter. For so long she had feared that stepping fully into this love meant erasing someone else's memory. But in his words she heard no erasure, only continuation. Slowly she rose and placed her hand over his. Her voice trembled but did not break. "Love doesn't replace Alexander. It expands. It makes room for what came before and what is still to come. I'm not here instead of her. I'm here because love asked me to be." Their foreheads touched, the fire crackling softly beside them, and in that moment something sacred passed between them. Not a grand declaration, not an ending, but a promise quietly sealed. Love had been tested, tempered by grief, refined by patience, and now it stood steady, warm, healing. The months that followed were filled with rituals that stitched their story tighter. Family nights became louder, funnier, more chaotic. Thanksgiving arrived with the house full of Caroline's laughter, the boys' drawings taped proudly along the walls, and Alexander himself basting a turkey while Maya teased him about his clumsy hands. Christmas unfolded with the boys racing to the tree at dawn, Maya's kindness notes tucked into stockings, and Alexander slipping a folded card into her hand that read simply, "You changed me. You changed everything." By the time spring returned again, the Reed household no longer felt fragile but firmly rooted. The garden bloomed. Children filled the garden room, and the sound of music and stories spilled freely into the air. Alexander often found himself standing at the edge of the porch, coffee in hand, watching it all, the boys laughing, Maya humming, life unfolding with quiet grace, and he would whisper to himself a truth he no longer feared, that love had returned, not to erase the past, but to honor it, to grow beside it, to lead them into a future strong and luminous. And so their story, born of loss, written through healing, blossomed into something timeless. It was not a fairy tale free of shadows, but a real love, messy, tender, unshakable. A love that showed how broken things, with careful hands and faithful hearts, could become beautiful again. If this story touched your heart, if it carried even a little warmth or healing into your evening, let it stay alive beyond these words. Press like as a way of saying you felt its truth. Share your thoughts in the comments, because your story matters too. And if you wish to keep walking with us through stories of love, healing and hope, don't forget to subscribe, so that the journey continues together